Of course, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is central to the Christian faith. There is no faith if these things didn't happen. And so one of the tasks of a Christian apologist is to make a historical case that Jesus lived, that indeed he was crucified, he was buried, and he rose from the dead. And it's interesting to note that both Christian and non-Christian scholars of the New Testament agree upon 10 facts about Jesus. And we've been going through these 10 facts, and so we have 2 more to talk about in this episode. So Travis, what are those 2 facts, and could you give us some details as to why critical New Testament scholars accept these facts?
Well, the next 2 facts are very easy to establish. They are the post-mortem appearances. That is the idea that the disciples experienced Jesus as a living reality sometime after his death. And then we have the sincere faith of the disciples that Jesus had experienced the resurrection and that sincere faith was life-changing for them. Concerning the post-mortem appearances, we have multiple independent lines of evidence suggesting that Jesus really did appear to his disciples. The most famous line of evidence would be that we have a creedal formula written by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 5. And in those verses, Paul says, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again from the dead on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And that 4-line formula, as I just said, is an early creed of the church. The parallelism, the Aramaic use of the word Cephas instead of Peter, all suggest that it was the product of the early church. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that he delivered to the Corinthians what he in turn had received. Now, when did he receive this creed that he's already delivered to the Corinthians? Well, most scholars go to Galatians 1 to establish when Paul received this information. And as I said before in an earlier episode, Paul converts to the Christian faith, and then 3 years after his conversion, he goes to Jerusalem and he converses with Peter and James about a number of things. And as C.H. Dodd pointed out, it's hard to believe that they just sat around and talked about the weather. Rather, this is probably when Peter gave this creedal formula to Paul, because Paul is explicitly trying to make sure that what God had revealed in him is in continuity with what the apostles had been teaching all along. Now, most scholars believe that Paul was converted within 2 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And therefore, if Paul's going to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, that means that we have a creedal formula inside of 5 years of the founding of Christianity, which speaks explicitly of Jesus' death for human sinners, his burial, his resurrection, and his appearances to Peter and the 12. And therefore, these appearance traditions are very early in church history. They're literally sitting right on top of the founding of the church. Paul will go on to say that Jesus appeared to 500 brethren at one time, and James, and then last of all, he appeared to me also, Paul says. And so we have an eyewitness telling us not only of the reception of an early creedal formula that was crafted by the early church, but we have a person saying, look, this man appeared to me also. It's also interesting that the resurrection appearances passes the criterion of embarrassment again, because you'll notice in the Gospels that women are the first people to experience resurrection appearances. I mean, it's embarrassing enough that men weren't able to discover the empty tomb. They are not even privileged with the initial appearances of the risen Jesus. And the resurrection appearances are multiply attested. The numinous quality of these resurrection appearances, and that's a fancy word for the fact that the resurrection body of Jesus seemed to be able to do things that most bodies aren't able to do. For example, in Luke's gospel, Jesus appears in a room despite the fact that the door had been locked. And yet, this risen Jesus is able to eat food with his disciples and make statements like, you know, a spirit does not have flesh and bone in the way that I have. So the multiple attestation, the criterion of embarrassment, the early nature of the creedal formula that speaks of the appearances, all indicate that the disciples really did have these experiences with the risen Christ. And this is why the atheist New Testament scholar Garrett Ludeman says, it can be taken as historically certain that the disciples had these experiences.
And so when a critical New Testament scholar says the disciples had these experiences, that doesn't necessarily mean that they think that Jesus rose from the dead.
Absolutely. Well, what we're establishing is the fact of the appearances, but we have not really offered an explanation for these appearances. The most common explanation that critics give is the idea that the disciples hallucinated the risen Jesus, that he didn't really rise from the dead, but this was a figment of their imagination. Now, that's something to be discussed later, but it is absolutely important to note that I have common ground with atheists like Gerrit Ludemann in saying, yeah, they did have these experiences, and that is a fact of history. The next fact is that the disciples came to a sincere and life-changing faith that Jesus had experienced the resurrection. And one of the reasons we know that their faith in Jesus was sincere and that it was life-changing is that most scholars, like the Jesus Seminar, grant that when Jesus was being crucified, the line in Mark which says, all the disciples fled and abandoned Jesus when he was being arrested, most scholars grant that that is a fact of history. So the disciples fleeing and running away and hiding when Jesus is being arrested is taken for granted by most scholars.
Because it's embarrassing again.
It's an embarrassing fact for the early church to know that your founders abandoned the Lord at his time of need. But notice also that days later, 50 days later or several months later at least, we see the disciples in Jerusalem boldly proclaiming the resurrection and being willing to die for their faith. And we know that the principal founders of the church, like James or Paul or Peter, that they died martyrs' deaths for their faiths. We know this because Josephus himself talks about the death of James in his Antiquities of the Jews. And he says, James, the brother of the so-called, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, and he goes on to describe the fact that James was stoned. And most grant that that stoning was done because of his faith in Jesus, among other things. And First Clement, which is an early epistle written, some scholars would put it at the very end of the first century, and one member of the Jesus Seminar actually puts First Clement before the year 70 A.D. So within just a few years of the deaths of James, Peter, and Paul, First Clement was written. And what does First Clement talk about? He talks about the deaths of Peter and Paul, that they died for their faith as well. Now, the very fact that these men died for their faith means that they sincerely believed that Jesus had experienced the resurrection. And I'm not saying that just because they died for their faith, that means that the resurrection happened. All I'm saying is that their deaths prove that their faith in Jesus' resurrection was a sincere faith. And the very fact that they were cowards when Jesus was arrested, but bold proclaimers of the gospel 50 days later, indicates that it was radically life-changing for them.
Particularly provocative to me is Paul dying
Yes.
as a martyr, because he, of course, was Saul of Tarsus, who was persecuting the early church initially before his conversion. So to think that he actually then suffered a martyr's death for the very thing that he was persecuting as a Pharisee is, again, really provocative.
Absolutely. And I think Robert Price, who is a Christ mythicist, is absolutely correct when he says that the questions surrounding the historicity of Paul are just as important as the questions surrounding the historicity of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Paul's life and teachings are one gigantic apologetic for the Christian faith. And I think that to the degree that you trust that what Paul is saying is true and that his testimony is true, and to the degree that you grant that he lived and died for his faith, I think that increases your confidence that what he was saying about Jesus is actually true as well. Also, I would add that not only an enemy of the church, but a skeptic, James, the brother of Jesus, died for his faith. Most critics grant that before Jesus died on the cross, James was a non-believer and a skeptic and a critic of who Jesus was. And one of the reasons they believe that is this criterion of embarrassment again. It keeps cropping up. Here's a leader of the Jerusalem church who is portrayed in the Gospels as a skeptic of Jesus' claims. What changed James from a skeptic to a firm believer? most will grant that Jesus must have appeared to James, and James came to a sincere faith that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Particularly if he's your half brother, because knowing how brothers are,
That's
right?
right. He must have been embarrassed over all the attention that this brother of his is getting.